For this reflection, I'm going to be doing another video. I started trying to write, and again, I just realized I can articulate my thoughts better speaking. So reflection obviously is on how the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are compromised or subverted by Frederick Douglass's memoir. Reading these in the same short span of time was pretty interesting. We know how contradictory the Declaration of Independence is from a 21st century viewpoint. And I think comparing it to Frederick Douglass's memoir, which was released about, I want to say around 60 to 70 years after the Declaration of Independence was written, it's interesting. It's an interesting comparison. So I'm going to be going over 3 points that I believe are important details when addressing the contradictions of the Declaration of Independence. Um, the three I mentioned are just kind of the three broadest and arguably most obvious, but honestly, you could write a novel on the various points of contradictions in general with the Declaration of Independence, but especially in regarding Frederick Douglass's memoir. So the first point, oh, fancy little transition for you. The first point I'm going to talk about is the very first line of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Um, I had a history teacher in high school who, when we were learning about the Declaration of Independence, he pretty much refused to say the phrase all men are created equal. He would always say all white landowning men are created equal. Because that's truly what the founding fathers meant by that statement. They did not mean obviously not all women. They didn't mean all men either. They meant all white men, um, are created equal. And I mean, the entirety of what we've read of Frederick Douglass's memoir, disproves that this is a not an accurate statement. Um, because these men were property. They weren't even considered a full human in the span of American in America. They were just not, they were considered 3/5 of a person, which is crazy that a person could have been reduced to a literal fraction um back then. But these people were not documented very well, if at all. And they were obviously treated horribly in such inhumane ways. And there was the portion of Frederick Douglass's book where he talks about not even knowing his birthday any more than a horse would. And I would say with my full chest that I believe there were slave owners who treated their animals better than they treated their slaves. Um, America is a country that's really built on the foundation of freedom, which is kind of insane to think about when our country was literally built on the backs of people who were not free. They were literally slaves, which is being enslaved is the complete opposite of being free. They're antitheses of each other. Um, so yeah, so these men were not created equal. All men were not created equal, and I think Jefferson knew that more than most. He was a very avid slave owner and a racist man, as many were back then. But again, it's not an okay thing, even for the times. It was never okay. So yeah, that's my first point. The second point is bringing up the denial of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, um, those are the three ideals that America's built on. They stem from John Locke, I believe. But all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in America, according to the founding fathers, which, again, is not true. These slaves were entitled to life. They were allowed to live until they weren't. Many of them were often murdered. Um, Douglas recounts many times he saw people get murdered or heard of people getting murdered. Like the one man who had been whipped so badly he jumped into the water, and when he refused to get out, he was shot and killed. And these slave owners faced no repercussions for doing this to their slaves because they were treated like animals, which even today we have laws against animal abuse that had those been in place back then, slaves may have been treated better, but they should have never been treated like animals in the first place, clearly. Liberty. they, I mean, I don't, this is beating a dead horse by saying this again, but they had no liberty. They had no autonomy. They worked and they maybe slept if they were lucky and maybe ate if they were lucky. And they died doing that for such a long time. And the pursuit of happiness, um, it's the same points. They had no pursuit of happiness. They were not allowed to do anything that brought them joy. And oftentimes, if they were, like a lot of songs were created by slaves and a lot of like types of music, and this was a way for them to like find a sprinkling of joy in their like utterly sad lives at that point. And the many slave owners, if they could hear them enjoying themselves as much as situation would allow, they would be punished. Most of these slave owners were bad people. They were just at their core just fundamentally awful human beings. So again, this is much similar to the first point, but they were denied life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They got to have a heartbeat sometimes until they did something wrong, but even that's maybe 2% of the 100% the statement is. So yeah. And my final point is the absence of justice and equality under law. Like I said in the last point, these slaves were murdered. Like they would be murdered by their slave owners and there would be no repercussions. And if there were, it was a slap on the wrist. And say there had been a trial for a murdered slave in the early 18th or the early, I guess, 19th century when slavery was still legal. This was before, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe this was before there was a jury of your peers. These juries would be full of white men who were probably also slave owners who they didn't care. And these slaves had no one to stick up for them, not at all. And even like the abolitionists in the North, they were not in the South. They were not there firsthand trying to help these people, which was, you couldn't hop on a plane back then, and they couldn't go free these people themselves. It wasn't that easy. This was deeply rooted in American history. And it still is, like systemic racism is very real and it stems from this period of time, but um there would never be justice for these murdered slaves. I mean, it's lasted, I mean, come on, we can look as recently as George Floyd, like that case may have ended differently if the public hadn't fought so hard. It's so this racism that started with slavery is so deep rooted in our society that um these things could argue to still not be argued to still not be true today. Don't get me wrong, I think we've made leaps and bounds of progress. Obviously, we don't have slaves anymore. But they're still very inherently racist people, and there probably always will be, and that's the unfortunate fact. But there's lots of contradictions in the Declaration of Independence, as there are in many of those founding documents in America. And yeah, so I hope I did my best to talk about the contradictions between the Declaration of Independence and Frederick Douglass's memoir. And I also just want to thank you for having us read Frederick Douglass's memoir. I'd read parts of it in classes over years, but I think reading that much of it in one sitting was enlightening in a way. It's all stuff I felt like I was aware of, but I think knowing it was a firsthand experience was different. It was different knowing that this was somebody's experience and not just a textbook. So, thank you.